Are you looking to manual swap your E36? Well, in this video, I'm gonna go through everything you're gonna need to manual swap your E36 and also give you a rough price of how much it's gonna cost you. So stay tuned. So we recently bought this E36 Vert behind us with the purpose of turning it into a drift car. Unfortunately, it was automatic, which would have been really hard to skid. So we went through and did a manual swap on it. If you do want to see more videos of us manual swapping this and rebuilding the engine, go check out my channel. And while you're there, subscribe. It's literally free. It helps the channel out heaps. So thanks so much for doing that, guys. You might be wondering, why would we get a automatic E36 when we can literally get a manual E36 and everything's already done? We don't need to mess around with the gearbox or anything like that. Well, specifically in Australia here, there's quite a big price difference between an automatic and a manual E36. So it's actually cheaper for us to just get an automatic E36 and spend the time and money manual swapping it than it would be to get a manual E36 in the first place. Also, with us drifting the car, there's quite a few components in the drivetrain and the gearbox that we'd like to upgrade or just replace. So it's actually a lot cheaper for us to just do all the work ourselves and replace those parts than it would be if we got a manual one, because we'd have to replace those components anyway. Now, the first item you're going to need is obviously a gearbox. There's quite a few options when it comes to gearboxes for the E36 and sitting behind an M5X engine. We went with a Getrag 250G, probably the cheapest gearbox that you can go for. It's also the weakest, so just keep that in mind if you are having a high-end build. But for our purposes, it's basically a stock M50 B25, so should be more than enough to hold the power. There are a few other options if you'd like to spend a bit more money. There's a ZF 5-speed, which is a lot stronger. There's also a Getrag 420G, which is a 6-speed. All prices will be in Australian dollars, but it depends on what currency you have, as well as your local market. So this gearbox is actually free because we had it lying around from our E46. But if you are buying a Getrag secondhand, you can expect to pay about $400 to $600, just depending on what you can find. Now, the next big ticket item that you're gonna need to get is a clutch and flywheel. So this is actually the automatic flywheel out of the car, but it'll look similar to this, and it's obviously for a manual transmission. I'd probably advise against getting a secondhand clutch and flywheel just because it is a wearable part. So you're probably gonna have to replace it anyway. Might as well put a fresh one in, that way you know it's all replaced and it's all new. For the purpose of this car, we went with a 6-puck Clutch Max kit. Obviously it's a little bit more aggressive than just a normal street clutch, just to be able to stand up to the abuse that the car's gonna get. Obviously, depending on what the purpose of your car is, if it's just a street car, you're obviously not gonna have as gnarly of a clutch as a track car or a drift car. The clutch kit should also come with a new pilot bearing for the flywheel, as well as a new throwout bearing. Make sure you replace the throwout bearing because they do go bad, and obviously it is something you want to replace while you're there. Otherwise, you have to pull the gearbox off. In terms of our build, the clutch and flywheel kit that we got with a throwout bearing and pilot bearing cost $903. The next item that you're going to need to get is new gearbox mounts. They obviously go between the gearbox cross member and the gearbox itself. So you can get new rubber ones or you can get aftermarket poly ones. We decided to go with poly ones. We did actually get them secondhand off Marketplace, but they were brand new and they set us back $50, which is a pretty good deal. You're also going to need to get a cross member that's manual specific only. It might come with the gearbox that you get, it might not. Just make sure you do have one of those, as it's pretty important. Obviously holds the gearbox, and that's where the mount's attached to the car. Also, another item that you're going to need to get is a new drive shaft. So you actually only need to get the front section of the drive shaft, which looks like that. That's manual specific, so you can reuse the old part of your shaft, which is this part, and just replace that part there that goes on like so. Obviously it depends on what sort of deal you can find. You might be able to get the tail shaft section that you need with the gearbox, but this cost us $300. We also got the gearbox cross member with that as well. So switching gears to the inside of the car, pun intended, you're gonna need to get a shifter. We opted for a floor mount BM Speed Shop shifter. This obviously mounts to the top of the trans tunnel. This deletes a bunch of the OEM bushings that like to fail, so you get a lot crisper shifts. The shifter itself set us back $185. You're also going to need a selector rod, which attaches from the shifter to the gearbox itself. We went with a dual shear selector rod. That was $140. You can just go with an OEM shifter if you'd like. but we just decided to go with the DSSR just because it was also from BM Speed Shop. Another item that might be good to replace while you're there is this shifter rod joint. It basically sits on the back of the gearbox like so, and that connects the shifter to the shifter selector shaft, I guess. There's a little piece of foam that goes in the back like so. That foam tends to get worn out, and obviously as it gets worn out, there's more play in the shifts. So it's definitely a good thing to replace while you're doing all this work. The new shifter rod joint was $69, so pretty pricey, but a good thing that you want to do just while you're there. So moving on to inside the gearbox, you're going to need to make sure that you have a clutch fork. It looks like this. It should come with your gearbox, but if you don't have it, you'll need to buy it. Obviously, we already had one with our gearbox, so we didn't need to get one. You can probably expect to pay up to $50 if you get it secondhand. If you are in a pinch, you can actually get them brand new from BMW. I have done that in the past. They're just obviously a little bit more pricey, but they usually are in stock, or they can get them pretty quick. So the clutch fork sits on the input shaft like so. There's also a pivot bushing that sits in here on the gearbox. The stock one is plastic, so you should upgrade it to a stainless or brass one. We use the stainless one in our gearbox. It costs us about $55. You're also going to need a metal clip that holds the clutch fork onto the pivot bushing, so make sure you have that one. Moving around to the back of the gearbox, one big ticket item that you definitely want to replace is called the Guibo. It's just a rubber flex disc that sits on the output shaft like so. So make sure you replace this because they do tend to go bad over time. Also, while you're replacing the Guibo, make sure you use OEM bolts as they have locking nuts, and also red Loctite them, just because with the vibrations of the drive shaft, those bolts like to get loose. Also, another maintenance item you probably want to replace is the rear main seal, as well as the rear main seal gasket. So the rear main seal was $35, the gasket was $13, and a new Guibo was $45. You're also going to need a new pedal assembly. So the manual pedals are obviously different to the automatic. So you're going to need to get manual pedals for obviously the clutch pedal, as well as a smaller brake pedal. You're also going to need a new clutch master cylinder. You can see it just in the back there. We went with an E46 clutch master cylinder, just because it's a lot smaller and easier to work with. It also gives a much lighter pedal feel, which is what I prefer. We actually got brand new pedals, which are a little bit more expensive, but it ended up costing us $500, which included an E46 master cylinder as well. You're also going to need 2 clutch hydraulic lines. There's a smaller line here which feeds the clutch master cylinder with brake fluid from the brake reservoir. You can pretty much get any line that's safe to use with brake fluid. Obviously, just use hose clamps as well. There's also the pressure line which goes from the clutch master cylinder to the clutch slave. You can see it all the way in the back here. Just throw a photo up there, but pretty much that runs from the pedal across behind the engine and down to the clutch slave on the gearbox there. So a new stainless steel clutch pressure line was $125, as well as a new clutch slave, which was $85. So there you have it. Those are all the parts that you're going to need. I'm going to go through the list and summarize everything. So we got the gearbox, which is a Getrag 250G. We're going to account $600 for that. Clutch kit, $903. Gearbox mounts, $50. Gearbox crossmember and tail shaft, $300. Selector rod, $140. Shifter, $185. Shifter rod joint, $69. Pedals with E46 master cylinder, $500. Clutch line, $125. Clutch slave, $85. Stainless pivot pin, $55. Rear main seal, $35. Rear main seal gasket, $13. And Guibo, $45. So that came to a total of $3,108, which seems like a lot of money, but I think given that we're going to do most of the stuff anyway, it ended up being cheaper. I'll be sure to make a list of all the parts I've mentioned in this video, along with the part numbers, and chuck them in the description below. So make sure you check that out if you are still struggling. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop me a comment below and I'll be sure to reply. So thanks so much for watching, guys. If you did get any value out of this video, make sure you chuck it a like, chuck me a subscribe. It's literally free, helps the channel out so much. So thanks so much for doing that, guys. But yeah, that's all from me. We'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.